The warehouse went quiet in the way places only do when something unfair is happening and everybody knows it, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Ethan Walker stood just inside the loading bay with rain still clinging to his jacket, his breath uneven, his hands cold from the drive, while Richard Kane stared at him like he had been waiting all morning for this exact moment. A wall-sized clock above the safety board flashed 8:09 a.m. in hard red numbers. 9 minutes late. 9 minutes, and Richard was acting like Ethan had set the whole building on fire. 8 years, Richard said, loud enough for every forklift driver, packer, and floor lead to hear. 8 years in this company, and you still think the rules don't apply to you. Ethan didn't answer right away. He could still hear the frightened catch in the pregnant woman's breathing from 20 minutes earlier. He could still see her standing in the rain outside the pharmacy, one hand braced against the brick wall, the other over her stomach, while people passed like she was just part of the morning traffic. He had not planned to stop. He could not afford to stop. His rent was due on Friday, his son Mason needed a new pair of sneakers before gym class next week, and his checking account had less than $200 in it. But then he had looked at her face one more time and known he would never forgive himself if he drove away. I helped someone, Ethan said finally, his voice low, careful, already tired. She needed to get to a hospital. Richard let out a short laugh that made several people glance down at the concrete. Of course she did, he said. And let me guess. Your phone died, traffic was terrible, and somehow you're the victim again. Ethan felt every eye in the building on him now. Not angry. Not cruel. Just helpless. The kind of helpless that comes from watching a decent man get cornered by a petty one with a title. He thought of Mason eating cereal before school, asking if they could still work on the model rocket tonight. He thought of saying yes without knowing whether he would even have a job by noon. Richard stepped closer, straightened his tie, and smiled the way weak men do when they finally get to play powerful. Turn in your badge, he said. You're done here. And for one long second, Ethan said nothing at all, because if he opened his mouth, the truth might sound too small to save him. Badge. The word landed harder than Richard probably intended, because Ethan had worn that plastic card on a lanyard for so long it no longer felt like company property. It felt like proof that he was still holding things together. He reached for it slowly, aware of the silence around him, aware of the forklift idling 3 aisles over, aware of a shipping clerk near the pallets pretending to check a clipboard just so he would not have to meet Ethan's eyes. 8 years. 8 years of early mornings, split shifts, missed school breakfasts, and driving home with sore shoulders just in time to help Mason with spelling words at the kitchen table. 8 years of doing what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. Ethan unclipped the badge but did not hand it over yet. His thumb moved across the worn edge without thinking, and for a strange second he was not standing in a warehouse at all. He was back in his apartment at 6 that morning, watching Mason pour too much cereal into a blue bowl with a chipped rim. Mason had looked up in that serious way children sometimes do when they are trying to act older than they are. You will be home tonight, right? He had asked. For the rocket? Ethan had smiled, reached over, and straightened the crooked collar on Mason's school shirt. I will be home, he had said. And we are finishing that rocket even if it takes us all night. That was the promise in his head now, louder than Richard, louder than the clock, louder than the shame trying to climb up his neck. Because losing a job was one thing. Walking into the apartment tonight and watching his son read the answer on his face before he could say a word was something else. Richard held out his hand, impatient now. I do not have all day, Walker. Ethan looked at him and almost said it all. That the woman had been scared. That the rain had soaked through her coat. That her hand had trembled when she tried to open the passenger door. That no decent man with a child of his own could have left her there. But something in Richard's expression told him the truth would only be turned into one more joke. So Ethan placed the badge in Richard's palm and said the only thing he trusted enough to say. I would do it again. A few people looked up at that. Just for a second. Just long enough for the room to feel different. Richard gave a cold smile, like Ethan had confirmed every story he told himself about men who cared too much and earned too little. "That is exactly why you do not belong here," he said. Ethan nodded once, grabbed his lunch cooler from the break shelf, and turned toward the exit with $32 in his wallet, an overdue electric bill on the kitchen counter, and no idea that before the morning was over, the woman he had helped out of the rain was going to walk through those same doors and change everything. The rain had not let up by the time Ethan reached the parking lot, and for a moment he just stood there beside his old pickup with his lunch cooler hanging from one hand, watching water slide off the hood in thin silver lines. He should have been thinking about what came next. He should have been calling a temp agency, checking his bank balance, figuring out how to tell Mason that the model rocket might have to wait because groceries came before glue and paint. Instead, his mind kept going back to the woman from that morning. The way she had tried to apologize for being a problem. The way her voice had gone thin when she said she was fine even though she clearly was not. Ethan had heard that tone before. Not from strangers. From people who had gotten too used to carrying pain quietly because they thought nobody had time for it. He set the cooler in the truck, reached into his pocket for his phone, and saw 2 missed calls from an unknown downtown number. He almost ignored it. On any other day, he probably would have. Debt collectors used numbers like that. So did billing offices and recruiters with jobs that paid less than survival. But then the phone rang again in his hand. Ethan answered with his shoulder still against the door. "This is Ethan Walker." The woman on the other end sounded polished, calm, and in a hurry in the way only people inside expensive buildings ever seem to sound. "Mr. Walker, please do not hang up. My name is Rebecca Sloan. I am calling from Whitmore Freight Systems executive offices. Ms. Claire Whitmore is asking to speak with you as soon as possible." Ethan straightened without realizing it. For one second he thought there had to be some mistake. He knew the company name, of course. Everybody in regional logistics knew it. Whitmore was not a warehouse. It was the company above warehouses, the kind with glass headquarters, quarterly reports, and people who never touched shrink wrap with their own hands. Ethan glanced back at the loading doors he had just been thrown out of and almost laughed at how ridiculous it sounded. "I think you have the wrong person," he said. "No, sir," Rebecca replied gently. "Ms. Whitmore was very specific. She said you helped her this morning and that she would like to thank you in person." Ethan felt the world shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to make him grip the phone tighter. Claire. The woman in the rain. The woman with tired eyes and a trembling hand on her stomach. He had helped her into his truck without asking who she was because the answer had not mattered then. It mattered now. "She is asking me to come there," he said. "Yes, sir. A car can be sent for you within the hour." Ethan looked down at the damp sleeve of his work jacket, then at the warehouse doors behind him where Richard Kane was probably already telling his version of the story. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, what he felt first was confusion. Then caution. Then something far more dangerous. Hope. The black town car arrived 20 minutes later, clean enough to reflect the gray sky in its doors, and Ethan almost did not get in. Men like him did not get picked up by executive cars on Tuesday mornings after getting fired from a warehouse. Men like him drove themselves home in silence, rehearsed bad news at red lights, and tried to figure out which bill could be pushed another week without the lights getting shut off. But the driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and said, "Mr. Walker," with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. So Ethan climbed in with his lunch cooler on his lap and watched the city change through rain-streaked glass. The farther downtown they went, the less the buildings looked like places where people worked with their hands. By the time the car pulled up to Whitmore Freight Systems headquarters, the whole place looked like it belonged in another life entirely, all steel and glass and polished stone, the kind of building where every surface reminded you that somebody powerful had signed off on it. Ethan paused under the front awning long enough to wipe his boots on the mat twice, suddenly aware of the damp cuffs of his jeans and the small tear near one sleeve of his jacket. Inside, the lobby was bright and quiet, with a wall of white orchids behind the reception desk and a security guard speaking into an earpiece like this was normal. Rebecca Sloane met him before he could second-guess being there. She was in her 40s, composed, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, but her expression softened when she saw him. "Mr. Walker," she said, offering her hand. "Thank you for coming." Ethan nodded, still unsure whether this was gratitude, formality, or the beginning of some conversation that would leave him feeling smaller than he already did. "How is she?" he asked before he could stop himself. Rebecca's face changed just enough for him to catch it. "Respect." "Stable," she said. "And very insistent that she speak with you herself." She led him to a private elevator that opened onto the top floor with a soft chime. No noisy warehouse fans. No backup alarms. Just thick carpet, muted light, and a hallway lined with framed photographs of cargo ships, trucks, and rail yards, as if the whole company wanted to remind people it still touched the real world somewhere far below. Rebecca stopped at a pair of oak doors, then turned to him. "Before you go in," she said, "there is something you should know. Ms. Whitmore did not call you here only to say thank you." Ethan felt his grip tighten on the handle of his cooler. "Then why am I here?" Rebecca gave him a careful look, as though choosing words that would change the shape of his day. "Because after she heard what happened to you this morning, she asked for the name of the manager who fired you." The doors opened before Ethan could answer, and there, standing by a window that overlooked half the city with one hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach, was Claire Whitmore, no longer just a woman in the rain, but the woman whose name sat on the side of the building itself. For a moment Ethan forgot the office, the view, the polished desk, all of it. He only saw the woman from the rain looking back at him with steadier eyes now, dressed in a cream blouse and charcoal slacks, her blonde hair pulled neatly back, her posture calm even with the strain of the morning still visible in the careful way she stood. Claire Whitmore crossed the room before he could say anything and offered her hand, but when Ethan took it, her expression softened into something more personal than executive courtesy. "I meant what I said through Rebecca," she told him. "Thank you for coming. And thank you for stopping when nobody else did." Ethan lowered his eyes for a second, uncomfortable with gratitude that large. "Anyone would have stopped," he said. Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. "No," she said quietly. "They did not." There was no drama in the way she said it, and that made it land harder. She motioned for him to sit in one of the leather chairs near the window, then sat across from him with the care of someone following doctor's orders she did not enjoy. On the low table between them sat a folder, already open, several pages clipped together inside. Ethan noticed at once that the top sheet carried the logo of the very warehouse he had just been marched out of. Claire followed his gaze. "After the hospital called my office and told me what happened this morning, I asked for your name," she said. "Then I asked what happened after you got back to work." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "You did not need to do that." Claire held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I did." The room stayed quiet for a beat. Outside the glass, downtown traffic moved in tiny silent lines far below. Inside, Ethan became sharply aware of the difference between the two of them. She was the kind of woman whose signature moved markets, whose decisions changed whole departments, whose name was etched into the lobby downstairs. He was a single father with $32 in his wallet and a lunch cooler still sitting by his shoes. And yet Claire was looking at him as if none of that was the point. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice turning cooler now, more precise, "is it true that your manager terminated you in front of the floor after hearing you were late because you took a pregnant woman to the hospital?" Ethan gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." Claire's jaw tightened almost invisibly at the formal answer, but she did not correct him. Instead, she picked up the top sheet in the folder. "Richard Kane filed an incident summary 9 minutes after dismissing you," she said. "He described you as unreliable, emotionally reactive, and unwilling to follow procedure. Ethan let out one short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. That sounds like Richard. Something flickered in Claire's eyes then, not amusement, but recognition. She had spent enough years around power to know exactly what small men sounded like when they wrote themselves into authority. She set the paper down. I asked to meet you because I do not intend to let his version of this become the official one. Ethan looked at her fully then, the first real surprise of the day breaking through the exhaustion. Claire Whitmore leaned forward, one hand resting lightly over her stomach, and said the words that changed the air in the room. Before this day is over, Ethan, I am going to find out exactly what kind of people have been running my warehouse in my name. Claire did not waste the next hour. While Ethan sat in a chair that still felt too expensive for him to lean back in, she moved through calls, reports, and names with the kind of quiet authority that made other people speak more carefully the moment she entered a sentence. Rebecca Sloane returned with a second folder, then a third. By noon, Claire had built a picture Ethan had never been meant to see. Richard Kane had not just fired people harshly. He had been protected while doing it. Complaints from warehouse staff had been marked resolved without follow-up. Schedule requests from employees with children had been denied in patterns too consistent to ignore. Safety concerns had been logged, redirected, and quietly buried. And above Richard's name, attached to approvals, transfers, and internal reviews, one name kept appearing again and again. Daniel Mercer, Regional Director. Claire stood by the conference table reading page after page, one hand braced lightly against the polished wood, her face becoming harder with every document. Ethan watched in silence, slowly realizing this was no longer about a late clock-in, or even about one manager enjoying the chance to humiliate a man with less power. This was a whole chain of people who had mistaken distance for leadership. How long have you known something was off there? Claire asked without looking up. Ethan thought about it. The favoritism. The way certain workers never got written up no matter what they did, while others were one mistake away from losing everything. The constant fear on the floor whenever Richard's voice carried across the loading bay. Long enough to stop being surprised by it, he said. Claire lifted her eyes then, and the sadness in them appeared before the anger did. That is not the same thing as acceptable. Rebecca placed one final page on the table. Visitor logs. Ethan did not understand why until Claire read the signature line and gave a humorless exhale. Daniel Mercer was at your warehouse at 7:30 this morning, she said. 1 hour before Richard fired you. Ethan frowned. So he already knew. Claire nodded once. Or he knew enough to make sure nobody challenged it. The room fell still. Ethan had spent years believing men like Mercer existed somewhere above the mess, too far removed to notice what happened on warehouse floors. It hit him slowly that sometimes they noticed perfectly well. They just benefited from silence. Claire closed the folder with deliberate care. I gave Richard Kane an opportunity this morning that he did not realize he was being given, she said. A chance to show what kind of company we are when no one important is watching. She reached for her phone, then looked at Ethan with a steadiness that felt almost personal now. He failed. So did Mercer. Ethan opened his mouth to say she did not owe him any of this, but Claire was already dialing. When the call connected, her voice turned cool enough to cut glass. Rebecca, get legal, compliance, and security to the North River warehouse in 1 hour. Tell Mr. Kane. And Mr. Mercer there will be a full staff assembly. And make sure every employee is present. Then she ended the call, faced Ethan fully, and said, you were dismissed in front of everyone. What happens next will happen the same way. The ride back to North River felt shorter than it should have, maybe because Ethan spent most of it staring through the tinted window trying to understand how the worst morning he had had in years was somehow turning into something he had never even imagined asking for. Across from him, Claire Whitmore sat with one hand resting over her stomach and the other on a closed folder in her lap, her expression calm in that deliberate way people get when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. She had changed nothing about herself before leaving headquarters. No softer clothes, no attempt to look less imposing. She arrived exactly as she was, which somehow made the whole thing feel even larger. When the car pulled into the warehouse lot, employees were already gathering near the loading bay doors, pulled off stations early, whispering in clusters, all of them trying to guess why corporate security vehicles had shown up in the middle of a workday. Ethan recognized the posture before he recognized the faces. Shoulders tense. Heads lowered. The look of people who had spent too long learning that bad news usually traveled downward. Richard Kane was near the entrance, jaw tight, tie straightened too carefully, his confidence forced now instead of natural. Beside him stood Daniel Mercer in an expensive coat, silver at the temples, carrying the polished annoyance of a man unaccustomed to being summoned anywhere. The moment Ethan stepped out of the car behind Claire, something moved through the crowd. Not noise exactly. Recognition. Confusion. The kind of silence that changes shape when people realize the story they were told might not be the real one. Richard's eyes snapped to Ethan first, then to Claire, and for the first time that day, Ethan saw uncertainty enter the man's face. Claire did not pause. She walked straight past him with Rebecca Sloan, legal counsel, and 2 compliance officers at her side, each step measured, each second stretching the tension tighter across the floor. "Everyone inside," she said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that did not need volume to be obeyed. Forklifts were shut down. Clipboards were lowered. Workers gathered in a half-circle under the same red clock that had watched Ethan lose his job that morning. Ethan stopped near the back at first out of habit, but Claire turned and said, "Mr. Walker, up front, please." Richard looked as though he wanted to object, but Mercer touched his sleeve once, a quiet warning from one man used to protecting another. Ethan walked forward feeling every eye on him again, only this time the feeling had changed. It was no longer pity. It was anticipation. Claire took her place beside the safety board, the white warehouse lights reflecting off the polished concrete, and let the silence settle until nobody in the room was breathing comfortably anymore. Then she looked directly at Richard Kane and asked the one question that made every person there go still. "Would you like to tell your staff," she said, "why you fired this man for helping me?" Richard Kane opened his mouth, but nothing useful came out. For the first time since Ethan had known him, the man looked stripped of the one thing he relied on most, the certainty that nobody above him cared enough to check his work. Daniel Mercer stepped in instead, voice smooth, practiced, already reaching for distance. "Ms. Whitmore, I am sure this is a misunderstanding. Mr. Kane made a time-sensitive operational decision based on attendance policy." Claire turned her head slowly toward him, and the silence that followed was worse than shouting. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. Then she faced the warehouse floor, not the managers, and her voice carried cleanly across the room. "This morning, on his way to work, Ethan Walker stopped to help a pregnant woman in medical distress because everyone else kept walking. He drove her to the hospital. He stayed until she was safely admitted. He gave his name and left because he was worried about being late to a job he had shown up for faithfully for 8 years. Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to." Claire rested one hand lightly over her stomach and said, "That woman was me." The air in the room changed all at once. Ethan heard it in the quiet intake of breath around him, in the scrape of one boot against concrete, in the way 3 employees near the pallet racks looked. From Claire to Ethan and back again like the story could not fit in their heads fast enough. Richard's face lost color. Mercer tried once more. "Claire, with respect, personnel matters require review, and making statements in front of staff before legal has concluded. Legal is here," Claire said, without raising her voice. She extended one hand toward the people standing behind her. "Compliance is here. Human resources is here. And so are records your office should have addressed months ago." Rebecca Sloan stepped forward and handed a file to legal counsel, who opened it without expression. Claire did not look away from Richard. "You dismissed a good employee publicly for choosing humanity over convenience," she said. You mocked the reason. You documented it dishonestly. And you did it under the protection of a regional director who appears to have spent years helping managers bury complaints in this facility. Mercer's polished composure cracked at that. That is an outrageous accusation. No, Claire said. It is a documented one. Then, with the same calm precision she had used all day, she ended both men where they stood. Richard Kane, your employment with Whitmore Freight Systems is terminated effective immediately. Daniel Mercer, you are relieved of all duties pending final board review, and your access to company property, records, and personnel ends now. No one in the warehouse spoke. They did not have to. Justice, when it finally arrives in a place that has gone too long without it, makes its own sound. Claire turned then, not to the managers, but to Ethan. And in front of everyone who had watched him lose everything that morning, she said, Mr. Walker, you are not fired. You never should have been. For several seconds Ethan could not move, because there are moments in a man's life when everything changes so fast that the mind refuses to catch up until the heart does first. Around him, the warehouse remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of people watching a lie collapse in real time. Claire Whitmore stepped closer, and when she spoke again, her voice was no softer, but it carried something steadier now, something that reached beyond punishment into the shape of what came next. Effective today, she said, Mr. Walker will be reinstated with full back pay for the hours lost, and that is only the beginning. Ethan looked at her, then at the faces around him, men and women he had worked beside for years, people who had seen him load trucks in winter, stay late during holiday rushes, swap shifts to cover emergencies, and never once asked to be noticed for any of it. He saw surprise there, but also something deeper. Relief. As if what was happening to him had cracked open the possibility that maybe what happened here did not have to stay the same forever. Claire turned to the staff and made it official. After a full review of his record and the conditions in this facility, I am appointing Ethan Walker as interim operations supervisor while we restructure North River management. This time the sound that moved through the room was impossible to miss. Not chaos. Not cheering. Just a wave of stunned disbelief, followed by the kind of quiet approval working people give when something finally feels earned. Ethan almost spoke then, almost said she did not have to do that, almost told her there were people in this building with more education, better suits, cleaner shoes. But Claire looked at him in a way that made excuses feel small. You already do the part that cannot be taught, she said. You notice people. You act when it costs you. The rest can be learned. That night, when Ethan opened the door to his apartment, Mason was waiting on the floor beside the coffee table with the half-built model rocket spread out over old newspaper. You are late, Mason said, then frowned as he caught the expression on his father's face. Is everything okay? Ethan set down his keys, crossed the room, and knelt in front of him. He smiled then, the first full, unguarded smile of the day. Yeah, buddy, he said. I think it finally is. A week later, the schedule at North River looked different. Parents were being heard. Complaints were being reviewed. Good workers were no longer treated as disposable just because they were quiet. A month later, Ethan moved Mason into a better apartment with windows that let in real morning light. And on a cool Thursday evening, just after they finished painting the rocket red and silver, Ethan's phone lit up with a message from Claire. It was short. The baby is healthy. Thank you for helping me make sure more than one life got better that day. Ethan read it twice, then looked over at Mason laughing on the living room rug, and understood something he had not had time to understand that morning in the rain. Sometimes the moment that seems to ruin your life is the very one that reveals who you were always meant to be.